Oh, I love being free and unemployed. Hold on. Right? I recognise you.
Me?
Yes, you.
Oh, you're Keir Starmer.
The one that ruined my life.
No, I think you did that yourself, mate.
No, you made 2 slanderous videos, completely not allowed, and now you're taking substances and eating fish and chips. That's my thing.
Yeah, well, that is your thing, isn't it, Keir?
Listen, if you're going to make fun of me, at least do it right.
Yeah?
Finish it right now. Finish the job.
Well,
Finish the job.
I guess it's only fair. Can I at least finish my fish and chips?
No.
What, are you telling me to get up, go home, and that you don't agree with what I'm doing?
Precisely.
All right, then.
This is the problem. You know me too well. This is why it must be you.
Oh, right. Yes. Hi, everyone. I will be doing a third Keir Starmer video, but I am going to actually finish my fish and chips first. And yes, the fish and chips are important, so keep that in your head until the end. I'm going to eat this now. I'm finally going to get to eat some dinner. When I finished my last very, very, very long video about Keir Starmer, I said I wouldn't do another video about him again. The first 2 that I did tried to do something a little different, and just to be very clear, you don't need to watch those 2 in order to watch this one. The first one was an attempt to catalogue and understand who he was, since the press weren't scrutinising him, and he was on course for a landslide victory. It felt important to have something where people could go and say, this is what the guy was like before he became Prime Minister. The second was, I will confess, something of a victory lap. Less than 6 months into his time as Prime Minister, it was clear he had squandered any chance to leave a meaningful legacy, and it was frankly a cavalcade of every basic mistake politicians are told not to make. It was truly a fascinating 6 months. It was a labour of hate, and as I said, you don't have to watch them. I'm not the type to set you 5 hours of homework. Come on, do I look like the kind of person who would do that? I'm referring to them because these videos try to answer different questions, and now that Starmer's time is coming to an end, or will have ended by the time this is out, I found that I had left something unanswered, and I would be dissatisfied if I didn't come back to finish the job. I want to think about why a person like Keir Starmer would put himself in a situation where he seemed to humiliate himself on a nearly daily basis, and what the point was in all of this. I have to believe that there was a reason for all of this, that there was something Keir Starmer and his surrounding project wanted to do, because I feel like if I had the fortune of drinking from the poison chalice that is being Prime Minister of the UK, I'd do it for a purpose, that I would attract people to work with me who wanted to work towards those goals, that everyone, no matter how much of an anomaly they seem in that role, would want to achieve something instead of just wanting to sit in the big chair. This has become a trilogy of videos where I really just want to understand who Keir Starmer is. I'm weirdly fascinated by him because he's such an anomaly, as I said. It's so obvious to me that he should never have become Prime Minister, and arguably should never have become an MP. Setting aside any commentary about him as a person, he's just very obviously not a natural politician. In any other country, he would have been a mid-level bureaucrat no one had ever heard of. The kind of person who lives out their days in blissful obscurity because no one would ever trust this person with real, meaningful power. Instead, he became Prime Minister and won one of the largest landslides of any political leader in modern British history. A majority so large that he could have done anything he desired. I joked in one of the previous videos that he could have sent Mr. Blobby to the moon, and that was barely an exaggeration, and he squandered it. He largely just did nothing of note with it, and the only things he decided to do were largely procedural moves intended to marginalize already marginalized people. It's just so confusing when you imagine yourself with that power and the kinds of things you do. Maybe they wouldn't work, but at least you'd try something, and he just seems to have sat there, letting the world go by, creating unnecessary scandals. And there has to be a reason. This video isn't going to be like the others because it's not going to be comprehensive, since the odds are if you've clicked on this, you already agree with me that Starmer was a complete disaster as Prime Minister. I don't need to persuade you with lots of evidence and comb over every single story of note. What I need is to understand what the point was in this waste of space becoming Prime Minister, how it all fell apart for him, and whether the answers we find are connected. Is there a story we can tell? If I had to summarize how Keir Starmer's time as Prime Minister is commonly interpreted, I would think of the clip from the hit film Jackass No. 2, where Steve-O does the rake jump. That is to say, an act where the painful and self-inflicted outcome is obvious to everyone who's watching, and all you can really do is laugh about it. Nothing is achieved by the rake jump, other than entertainment for people who relish in someone else's pain or who have intrusive thoughts about doing weird stunts like that. Guess which category I fell into when I watched that film. My summary is a bit more complicated. Yes, there's self-inflicted harm stemming from very obvious mistakes. The most notable and damaging was his decision to appoint Peter Mandelson, an associate of Jeffrey Epstein, and generally a known crook in British political circles, to the post of US ambassador. There's also an inability to use the massive majority the British public gifted him, in part because his political priorities were out of step with a parliamentary party that Keir Starmer and the faction around him had a significant hand in shaping. Imagine, he was such an obviously incompetent leader, people he handpicked thought he was fucking useless. To call it embarrassing would be an understatement. His MPs also turned on him because it was clear that Starmer disdained the song and dance of politics, which might be to his credit, but is the kind of attitude that requires you to be nearly flawless once you're in office. What didn't help was the fact that this was clearly about him not wanting to explain himself to lessers, as exemplified by his comments soon after winning the leadership of the Labour Party, that he hated selling himself to the members of his own party who elected him. Like, this is his electorate, and he hated selling himself. This attitude isolated him from any potential base of support, which meant that even if you think he enacted policy that will make a difference, and I would argue that there's a conversation to be had there, that once scandals and controversies began to hit, no one was particularly invested in his political project, and certainly not in him. This isn't just about the public. It's clear from how quickly support drained away from him in the wake of Andy Burnham's victory in the Makerfield by-election, that basically no one supported him in particular, regardless of how they felt about the policy offering. To say nothing of how the controversies and failures eventually spiraled so far out of control that any movement on policy was basically drowned out by it, whether it was passes for glasses, the winter fuel allowance, no fewer than 2 poorly received budgets, Peter Mandelson, the constant staff issues, the denial of racism in his own party, the support for Israel's genocide, the Island of Strangers speech, the transphobia. I mean, I could go on, but I promised this wouldn't be comprehensive. So just imagine that there is so many more things I could point to. It wasn't just self-inflicted damage. The pattern was so consistent that you have to conclude that this was more than mistakes. There was something deliberate behind this alongside the circus-like demeanour that his government took on in its dying days. He was something between Boris Johnson and Theresa May. He was kind of like a emerging of them, propped up in office because no one was sure who would replace him until someone came to take a shot after a disastrous election like Theresa May, and reduced to his explanation for his excesses being that he was fundamentally unfit to be Prime Minister, like Boris Johnson. Far from being a break from the preceding Conservative government, he was in perfect continuity with them, and considering how that went for the Conservative Party at the last election, it cannot be a surprise that it ended quite literally in tears. There's a temptation to overemphasize a particular moment and say, this is where it all went wrong, when we try to assess how we got from a huge landslide to resignation. I want to resist that as much as possible, but Starmer provides an incredible sequence of events that really show when it became clear that he would be forced out of office. In September 2025, Keir Starmer took the opportunity to do something he became rather famous for, relaunching his leadership, reorganizing his team. He announced phase 2 of his government around a year into his time as Prime Minister. Now, Starmer had relaunched multiple times in opposition, and this marked the start of an accelerating trend of relaunches from him in government. By my count, since becoming Labour leader, he's made 17 of them. There are some people, believe it or not, who think the number might be even higher than that. I'm not so sure. That's a debate we will have separate from this video. Phase 2 was a special one, though. In a lot of ways, it made some sense. Just over a year into government, Starmer wanted to project a narrative that the government, having consolidated and set itself up for further success, was now going to help the country turn a corner, decisively leaving behind the 14 years of failed Tory government. This was undermined by the fact that not a whole lot of successful and popular policy and politics had been conducted in that year. Starmer, by this point, had, among other things, already gone through the crises of the winter fuel allowance, the 2-child benefit cap, the first wave of attempted pogroms over the summer he got into office, a budget that went down like cold sick, and continuing to target vulnerable groups like trans people and the disabled. None of which helped him build a reliable constituency among the electorate, Labour MPs, or build a sense that this was a government that had set itself up to capitalise on any opportunities. All of that being said, I can see why they wanted to do this, and had things played out a little differently, maybe I wouldn't find Phase 2 as funny as I do now. But of course, you know it didn't go well. Phase 2 was announced on September 1st. By September 5th, Labour's deputy leader at the time, Angela Rayner, had resigned, triggering a reshuffle. By September 7th, an article was published in The Guardian with a headline that frankly summarises so much about Starmer in office. Senior Labour figures tell Keir Starmer to stop making mistakes. Truly, it is one of the greatest headlines in British history. Not just because it's funny to look at a guy like Starmer, whose defining political characteristic is that he makes mistakes and demand that he stops, but just because it is incredible to tell the Prime Minister to simply get good at being Prime Minister. Honestly, that headline is comedy gold. Keir Starmer had made a controversial appointment that might turn out to be one of these mistakes, and I think is one of the moments that really crystallized how doomed he was in office. He appointed Peter Mandelson, a person whose association with Starmer's project and Jeffrey Epstein I had pointed out all the way back in that first video I did, to be US ambassador. I cannot emphasize enough how little of this was a secret in terms of his association with Jeffrey Epstein, and how automatically disqualifying it should have been. I can't speak to the motivations behind this, but it looks an awful lot like Starmer thought two Epstein associates might get along, for whatever reason. This known association between Mandelson and Epstein suddenly became the focus of renewed attention with the release of the Epstein files, which led to the spectacle of Starmer very clearly defending his decision to appoint Mandelson as US ambassador in Parliament and giving him his full backing on September 10th, which then led to Starmer's personal 9/11, where he was forced, after further press attention on revelations about the nature of Mandelson's relationship with Epstein, to sack him as US ambassador. Phase 2 had, in 10 days, gone from the country is about to turn a corner, trust the process, to oops, I had to sack the known Epstein associate after over a week of chaos stemming from a reshuffle forced on me by my deputy leader resigning. Oh, by the way, I very publicly and loudly backed the known Epstein associate. You can't really say it went well. This dithering in the face of the obvious, allowing problems to fester and compound, is really what killed any chance of Starmer succeeding in government. I mean, it was also the bad policies and politics, which we'll get into, but a lot of these are also symptoms of this inability to exercise good judgment. I found it interesting to see where the media, both social and legacy, has decided the responsibility is for this spectacular collapse Starmer has gone through. Where I would point to an obvious unfitness to govern, an unpopular policy platform, and a project with dishonesty at its core, the press seems to have doubled down on a narrative that some elements started seeding prior to the local elections, perhaps in preparation for the result being so bad it forced Starmer out. This is the notion that Britain has become ungovernable, that the public simply do not wish to wait for results and will take out their impatience on whoever becomes Prime Minister. I did a whole video about this before the local elections, since the seeds were being planted at that time, so I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into this, but I will summarize some things I said in that video. Link in the description, you know the drill with that sort of thing. Fundamentally, this is an argument that is blaming the public for the failures of the political class, and given the sheer volume of mistakes Starmer made and the depth of anger at him, it seems odd to look at that and say it's the public being unreasonable, especially when things continue to get worse and worse. Yes, the line on the graph may say, we've never had it so good, but the fact is that day-to-day life has become harder. Everything is more expensive, and the government is nowhere to be seen. And it's not like the private sector is ever going to pick up that slack. My life has become harder. Yours has probably become harder. And whatever else you might think of the Prime Minister of the day, their key to survival is to navigate politics in a way that doesn't allow that to happen. For all this talk of ungovernability, the UK comes across more as ungoverned. Another framing around why Starmer failed is exemplified by Trevor Phillips, who took to the airways to declare that Starmer's failure was in fact political, which I suppose is a start, but that it was because he contradicted his often repeated mantra of country over party. A mantra he contradicted, according to Phillips, because Starmer did things like remove the two-child benefit cap and wasn't hard enough on immigrants, which were things that the country at large wanted. And it's largely true. The two-child benefit cap, despite its horrible impacts, polls well. Now, I would say that the popularity that matters is how it's received by families with 3 or more children, and that this wildly misunderstands what the point of a government and of our parliamentary system is. They're not there to be perfect delegates replicating national opinion, but to do what their judgment tells them is best for their constituents, even against their wishes. Setting aside my views on the policy itself, and the frankly tortured route Starmer took to removing the two-child benefit cap, which did contribute to his failure, important to note, this is an odd line to take. The information we have about the local elections, which are the most recent large-scale vote we've had, shows that Labour's losses were, yes, to all political forces in the country, but seem to be concentrated in political parties and local groups who are either more liberal or significantly to their left. which makes the "he failed to put country over party by not being right-wing enough" line hard to take seriously as a hypothesis. Yes, the 2-child benefit cap polled well when the impacts weren't explained, but the unpopularity of it was probably concentrated in those people who abandoned Labour for forces to its left. It's also just the case that when Labour are in government, there's no point trying to be right-wing tough guys, because that's not what people want or expect from a Labour government. Philip's hypothesis is basically that Starmer lost, or ended up resigning, because of people who never voted Labour abandoning him. But surely the final blow was the realization that long-term Labour voters were abandoning them, as demonstrated across particularly urban areas at the local election. I don't think the problem with Starmer was that he wasn't right-wing enough, if I may shock you with that analysis. A final set of responses I found interesting were people on social media, but also some legacy media figures, appearing confused by how deep and intense the hatred of Starmer is. This confusion usually stems from an understanding of Keir Starmer as a moderate and inoffensive politician. Uncharismatic, sure, but not anything that's worthy of intense hatred, at least not to the people I saw expressing this surprise. Among the legacy media figures, I found that they were generally older, whiter, tended to be wealthier. On social media, I think they tended to be either a sort of reactionary centrist, or the kind of person who had assumed a certain outcome from getting a grown-up in office and was left bewildered by that not happening. This understanding of Starmer as an inoffensive, kind of boring managerial type is founded on a misunderstanding of how his government has been experienced by a lot of people. Considering the collapse in living standards and wages the UK has been suffering from since the financial crash, there's nothing moderate about continuing the policies that precipitated that collapse. It certainly has the appearance of moderation to do very little in the face of it, but to the rest of us, an already intolerable situation is being made worse, and it's being made worse with this stupid handprick's face all over the news. Maybe you think the decline in the economy is not a sign of an immoderate politician or an extremist, despite his and Rachel Reeves' insistence on sticking to fiscal rules that married them to austerity. Itself a policy that's resulted in at least hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million premature deaths. Perhaps then we need to look at the fact that if you're a trans person in the UK, you were freer under the Conservatives than you are now under Labour. Before Labour came into office, trans people, while under attack certainly, weren't on such a direct path to being eliminated from public life. And they weren't this far along that path. And before anyone gets all, oh, but the Supreme Court and the Cass Review and all of this other, Starmer and the Labour Party were in possession of one of the largest majorities in British history. If they disagreed with the marginalisation of trans people, they could have at any time legislated to stop and reverse it. They didn't, and far be it for me to judge anyone, but I would say supporting the elimination of a group of people from public life is an extreme act. It is not the act of a milquetoast, mild-mannered middle manager just trying to keep the show on the road, to say nothing of the abysmal position his government took on Palestine, how it had to have its arms twisted into recognizing the state of Palestine, a gesture that means nothing given how much political cover Starmer has given to Israel's genocide of Palestinians. Starmer earned the depth of hatred shown towards him because he was out of step with maybe not the whole British public, but with the parts of the British public that aligned traditionally with the party he led. That's why the reaction to him is so visceral. It's one thing for the Tories to be like this. We price that in. It's quite another for Labour to do this. The viscerality he generates is from a justified sense of betrayal from his party's traditional base. There's also been some coverage that's pointed out that the press knew all along that Starmer was ludicrously unfit for the role of Prime Minister, but we'll probably be swinging back to that whole thing later on, so make a note of it. It will be on the test, just like the fish and chips. In order to really find out where the roots of Starmer's failure was, we need to cast our minds back to the 2024 election campaign. A pretty dull affair when compared to other recent British elections, aside from Ed Davey enjoying his summer holiday. Labour were almost certain to win that election. If you look at the polls from the start of the campaigning period, Labour were recording leads as high as 26%. It would have taken an incredible sequence of events for Labour to record any result other than a landslide victory in these circumstances, which naturally shaped the campaign. Labour and Keir Starmer did not want to take any unnecessary risks, which, given how ridiculed he became over the course of the campaign, with one of my personal highlights being people openly laughing at him for mentioning that his dad was a toolmaker and how much Labour's polling declined, was probably the right choice. If I could sum up Labour's campaign, it would be in the repeated slogan, stability through change, which on the surface seems contradictory, but I took it to mean that Labour would restore a pre-conservative stability where they wouldn't go through 3 prime ministers in one parliament, which would itself represent change, which is a very convenient framing to enter government with, because it's not that hard as a prime minister who wins a landslide to project stability, and I can see the argument for this. Stability in leadership would create the space to actually get on with some governing. That is, if they actually had any kind of plan to govern that could carry them through the 5 years of a parliament. I would like to introduce you to this, the Labour manifesto for the 2024 election. I specifically didn't talk about the Labour manifesto in the first video I did about Keir Starmer, primarily because it wasn't out at the time of writing, but I think it's useful to explain why I wouldn't have even if it was out, and why I didn't really engage with any promises Labour had made up to that point in the campaign, and why I will talk about it now. I wouldn't have talked about it at the time because there was no reason to believe that Keir Starmer would base his governing project on this manifesto. Like, this manifesto, it's nothing to do with his governing project, or on the things that he'd said up until that point in the campaign. A key assertion I made in that video was that Keir Starmer was a known liar who lies all the time, and that rendered this manifesto worthless in terms of analysing how he'd govern. What was more valuable was understanding the direction his dishonesty moved him towards, and it was almost always towards the right and towards reactionary politics. This time, for this final chapter, I will mention this manifesto and actually talk about it for possibly quite a while, because it is the culmination of a political project that was, depending on how you saw it, watering itself down or slowly revealing its true face. And unfortunately, its true face was this. The seeds of Labour and Keir Starmer's failure can be seen in this document and in the election campaign that accompanied it. It's best to understand the manifesto itself as kind of like the book that the election campaign was the adaptation of. It is less about the policies than you'd expect and more about the narrative it wants to portray. This is especially true because what policy exists in this document is intentionally light and vague. A lot of it is shielded in language like over the next parliament, which feels designed to allow the government to delay as long as possible on delivery. It's also important to point out how central to this Starmer appears to be. I mean, he's on the cover, right? But he's not just on the cover, but in over half the photos in this manifesto, I decided to check, it really is wildly out of step with every recent manifesto from both Labour and other rival parties, which tend to at least resemble in some vague way a plan and don't have the leader plastered all over it. I speculate that the vagueness and the shielding of any quantifiable policy from any hard deadlines is to give the government maximum scope to either act without being accused of breaking its word, or give it enough time to run out the clock on those promises so that they can go into the next election saying, hey, we tried, but here's the number we're really going to hit this time around. A good example of where they clearly set themselves up to have maximum range to do as they wished is on page 103. Labour will build on the Online Safety Act, bringing forward provisions as quickly as possible and explore further measures to keep everyone safe online, particularly when using social media. Which, by the way, for those who got angry at me for blaming Labour for the Online Safety Act, is why I blamed them for it. They voluntarily bound this parliament to the decision of the previous one. Any negative consequences aren't just the Tories' fault, but theirs. One of the notable parts of the narrative they weave in this is found in how often they use terms like restore hope or turn the page. They really want to be seen as a clean break with the preceding Conservative government. I mean, look at the cover. It's one man and one word, change. In this, we can see what the real promise they wanted to convey was. That by electing this man as Prime Minister, things would change. Now, I want to put this to you. Has your life changed for the better since he became Prime Minister? Mine hasn't, but I have to accept that I can't represent anyone other than myself in that. The portrait of Britain that's painted in this manifesto that we're supposed to be turning the page on is one that is, to put it bluntly, fucked. An analysis that I think a lot of us agree with. Even if the contents of the manifesto are unambitious and vague, the main message conveyed through the cover and through the language is one that wants the illusion of a grand vision, which helps explain why Labour's government seemed to crumble upon contact with the reality of government. And if you look at the polls through the election campaign, Labour and Keir Starmer seemed to crumble once the public paid attention. What specific promises there are either very minor in the grand scheme of things. If you can, divide one number by another, a lot of the ambitious sounding numbers are exposed as a drop in the ocean. Or they're so granular that they're the kind of thing that basically no one is going to check on. Like, be honest with me. Did you know that Labour, in their manifesto, said that they would end the injustice of the mine workers' pension scheme? That detail genuinely slipped by, and who would ask if he'd met that manifesto commitment? Genuinely, I don't think many people would. To the extent that there are things that can be tracked, a lot of them are best boiled down to, we're going to hold a review, or we're going to empower a committee. Basically, politics as process type stuff. This alongside Starmer's predilection, which carries on into the manifesto, for missions, goals, steps, pledges that are numbers for easy tracking, really speaks to how much of his particular skill set is that of a middle manager. Reviews and committees are a great way to build a dashboard that shows a lot of green to indicate that you've done something. They're also very easy. Like, I could pick up the phone right now, well, not right now, it's my teleprompter, and call a friend and tell them to do a review for me of something. While that's a gross oversimplification of what the government does when they initiate these things, it's not a million miles off. They are a great way to do what every middle manager loves, to have the appearance of doing something with none of the risks or effort inherent to actually going out and doing the work. Take Labour's commitment to reviewing universal credit so that it makes work pay and tackles poverty. The Labour Party had 14 years in opposition to come to a position on the welfare state, and the best they can do in this manifesto is a review and some platitudes. Genuinely, if you turn to a random page, there will be a sentence like, we will review this policy area, as if they didn't have 14 years to figure it out. It's genuinely like that. They must really have been betting heavily on no one reading it. This document plastered with images of Starmer is not a document for governing. It is a watered down, vague and undercooked piece of political work, given how long the party had to produce a serious program. even if Labour had produced a document that was heavy on details and represented a coherent programme for government, it seems the actual leadership of the party that would be directing this had no real plan to govern, made all the more remarkable by the fact that Liz Truss's short-lived tenure as Prime Minister had all but guaranteed they'd form the next government. There's reporting that Keir Starmer, who seems to favour delegating as his leadership strategy, which there's nothing wrong with inherently, entered government expecting his then Chief of Staff Sue Gray, a former civil servant, to have a plan ready for him. It's obvious now in hindsight, but no such plan existed, and the fact that Starmer didn't even think to ask his Chief of Staff if she'd done this thing he'd expected speaks very poorly about not just his political acumen, but what kind of leader he even was. You could see that there wasn't a coherent plan in the way he handled a few critical moments that really stick out. I would say 3 good examples are the winter fuel allowance, the 2-child benefit cap, and the plans to impose mandatory digital ID on us, which it turns out they're kind of doing through the under-16 social media ban coming in early 2027, even if Burnham says he's not going to do it, but I kind of think he will anyway. So even if we don't want that, we're probably going to get it anyway. I love living in a democracy, everyone. Whatever you think of these policies, Starmer and the team around him were either unable or unwilling to sell them to the relevant people who needed to be persuaded. Whether that was the general public in the case of mandatory digital IDs, an idea whose popularity collapsed with Starmer's endorsement, or things like making the winter fuel allowance means tested and keeping the 2-child benefit cap, which met with serious opposition within his parliamentary party. These are just the high-profile examples of where Starmer was incapable of fighting his corner and where he contradicted the general tone and promise of his election campaign. I suppose in fairness you might say, change doesn't specify whether it's good or bad, but the unwritten understanding is that politicians generally don't run on fuck you, you'll take what you're given, and that's how Starmer tried to run his government, which is why the entire thing went into meltdown almost immediately upon entering office. Almost 2 years of this abject failure and wasting of time had made him the least popular prime minister in recorded history. A staggering achievement. There is a tendency among some of Starmer's die-hard defenders, and yes, there are still some, and certain commentators to blame his failure and his unpopularity on the press. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that a key pitch that was made for Starmer compared to his predecessor as Labour leader was that he would be able to navigate the British press. The other is that the press coverage of him was extremely lax before he became Prime Minister. That was one of my motivations in making that first video. Starmer was plainly the least scrutinised leader of the opposition in living memory. And one wonders, if he had been scrutinised before the election, whether these obvious flaws would have been exposed in a way that prevented us from wasting 2 years with him as Prime Minister. It's a counterfactual and we'll never know, but you can't help but wonder. It would be one thing if he was merely inept at politics, but he insisted on putting process above politics, and then turned out to not be very good at following process, which as a politician who relied on an image as a rule-following human rights lawyer pretty much left him with nothing. The substance was always light, but what was there was basically turned to ash. This fixation on process is why a common complaint among Labour supporters, what about the good things, doesn't cut through, even if we discount that those good things have come at the cost of inculcating even more bigotry into our government and our wider culture. If you are the kind of person who fixates on processes, even if your processes produce good outcomes, it leaves you unable to build on those successes. all you can do is rely on process after process yielding good results. And speaking as something of a long-term observer on the processes of the British state, that's not a very reliable gamble to make. So to make up for that risk, you need to engage in a bit of politics, and Starmer just seemed to refuse. In the eyes of the public, he was an irritable, awkward technocrat with a terrible voice who seemed to resent being held accountable at all. Maybe that's an unfair characterization, but you can see it plainly. If you stand for nothing, if there's no principle that can't be bent to the whims of process, no one will stand by you even if you do something for them. Another key thing to understand if we want to get our heads around how this remarkable collapse has happened is what Keir Starmer's cheerleaders in the press understood his appeal and character to be. In the first video I did about him, I summarized this in a semi-joking way with these 7 qualities. 1, competence. 2, that he's not that corrupt. 3, that he's a grown-up. 4, he's secretly a radical if you give him a chance. 5, he could transform organizations with his mere presence. 6, he's a human rights lawyer, so therefore he's good. 7, he's a salt of the earth, kind of normal guy. Looking back over the past couple of years, how many of those do we think are still points that the press would defend? Now, a lot of the press is openly saying Keir Starmer is obviously completely ineffective and was a useless prime minister, and have now moved on to ascribing some, if not all, of those positive qualities to Andy Burnham, which should probably be ringing some alarm bells. I'm going to pick on a specific article in Journalist now, but I want you to understand that this person was not the only one, but the quote from this GQ article is such a perfect summary of what these people thought Starmer was, and really helps to illustrate why certain scandals really wounded his premiership. This quote is from an article by Glenn O'Hara called "Keir Starmer is the Labour Party in Human Form," which may have turned out to be truer than we could ever imagine. Here is how Starmer's skill set is described. Starmer can chair a meeting, he can draft a minute, he can lead a team, he can hold a press conference, he can liaise with different offices, he can stay calm in an interview. Those skills look simple, but they're not, and they're vital to the air of concerned but kindly manager that he projects. To go from this image, which was carefully cultivated, to claiming that you don't know who Peter Mandelson is, and that information a YouTuber could find through a simple search was simply unknowable to you as Prime Minister, or perhaps worse, that the relationships and history of scandal was something that you could overlook, is certainly going to severely damage a leader. Starmer's argument around the Mandelson scandal and around any instance where corruption and corner cutting were found was to basically insist that he didn't know about it, that it hadn't crossed his desk, that it was the fault of a subordinate. And maybe that was true in some of these cases, but through all of the many scandals that engulfed his government, there was one common factor: him. If he was indeed a concerned but kindly manager, might he have acted on some of these concerns? Might that concern have extended to literally one of the most corrupt figures in British politics of the past 3 decades, who was also publicly known as an associate of Epstein, being suggested for a very senior diplomatic role? I simply cannot believe that someone who's competent to be Prime Minister can be unaware of everything happening around them. It got to the point where people wondered openly how he got there in the first place, which we will be talking about in a little bit. But for now, I want us to take a breath. I want to take a breath and relax and to think about how we can summarize this. For those of you who want to explain this to your friends without making them sit through my video, I've come up with a short, snappy way to remember this and to name the system that produced this outcome. So when you're trying to explain to your friends how Keir Starmer got to where he did, I want you to think of Keith.
That's not going to go well. How do you write a K? How do you write a K? This is not funny. This is very serious. I'm like...
Straight line down.
Yeah.
45 degrees both ways.
That's a K, isn't it?
Yeah.
A special K.
A special K.
And look, it's even in line. Look at that. Look at that.
Pretty good.
That's some... My fucking year 8 English teacher can bite me because I'm not illiterate. I can write the word Keith, admittedly spelling it in a slightly odd way, but I can do it. Hello everyone, I'm in the pub now because I imagined this part a little differently, but to be honest, shooting this all in my flat would have probably melted my brain. And it's just so nice, I thought why not do the video outside, but inside a pub. Also I have a whiteboard and I can't really write very well, so let's see where this goes. If, for whatever reason, you want to explain to your friends and family why Keir Starmer failed, and you don't want to go through all the little details like I just did in that last section, what you need to do is think of the system he employed from opposition all the way into government and think KIETH, because it's called the KIETH System. That's K-I-E-T-H, and I had to double check that before I did this, which is how KIETH is spelt. Each of these letters represent a key practice of Starmer's entire political project, from him to Morgan McSweeney to all those weird angry MPs who came out to defend him, all the way until Andy Burnham became MP for Makerfield. So if you want to govern like our most hated Prime Minister, what a strong offer, by the way, that I'm making for people. This is how you do it. Which brings me to the first letter, K. I'm going to have to write this down real quick. Keep promising. I don't know how to spell promising. Things. That I do know how to spell. Yes, I nailed that. See, that's perfect. So, but my handwriting is so bad still. Keep promising things. I wrote that really well. You see, the electorate is a lot like a prospective romantic partner. They want to see a little effort. You know, don't wear a shirt with mustard stains on it. No, there's not a mustard stain on this one. Where a romantic partner might want you to, like, brush your hair, go somewhere nice. You make sure you're wearing a shirt that's, you know, funny sometimes. With an electorate, the relationship is a lot more transactional. You need to convince the electorate that they're better off with you than without you. It's often said in Britain that oppositions don't win elections, but governments lose them. And if you look at any of the elections over the past 50 years where the governing party has changed, I can see why you'd think that. You still need to convince enough people at the right time that you're the person for the job. In the case of Keir Starmer, he had to convince people in 3 layers. I might draw this. No, I shouldn't draw this. I need to stop trying to do things I can't do. First, he had to get nominated in a leadership contest. Then he had to convince Labour members. And then he could get to work convincing the general public. That's why Starmer seemed to iterate through so many different sets of promises. Whether it was his now infamous 10 pledges, or his first steps for change in the manifesto, which were quickly followed by 5 missions for government. You can see why people get confused about what this guy stood for. The point is that if you keep promising things, you look like you're going to do something about the problems people face. Sure, if you make wildly contradictory promises, over time some people notice, but if you've done it right and the government you're up against is, you know, historically unpopular, what's losing a few fleas? That's probably fine. You can shake off the fleas, and that famously ends really well. You can still win, but people might notice that you've watered down what you're promising, and it could get awkward. So what you need to do in order to make sure you're not called out too harshly is to get some expert assistance. This is where I comes in. You see, if you're attempting to become the Prime Minister of the UK, or really any country, a little help goes a long way. And there are a lot of people who are willing to give you their advice when you're the leader of the opposition. Not all of them mean well, but you find the right one with the right political priorities, and it can be a really huge boost, which is why I introduce, this is going to be a really weird one, Epstein Associates. This is mainly the writing is the problem.
Nightmare spelling bee prompt.
This is the worst thing I've had to... I hope I wrote this correctly. So an example of an Epstein associate is Peter Mandelson. Now, it doesn't have to be an Epstein associate as such. Epstein is just an example of the kind of person your helpful, connected benefactor should be associating with. Someone powerful, connected, who can help you find other helpful people and organizations that might want to lend a hand, or give you Taylor Swift tickets and lend you a flat, as the case may be. You know, it depends on the guy. The kind of person your Epstein associate might know could provide things like donations. They could second staff to your office. They might know people in certain industries that have a sense of being up and coming, like AI. They might even have extensive connections with the British press, both the journalists and the owners. You have to be careful to follow the rules. I mean, you know, Keir Starmer, he loved to be called Mr. Rules after all. Everything has got to be above board, legal, declared at the correct time, all of the good stuff. When you keep promising things and you're making these associations and connections and you're getting all of this very generous help, suddenly a sense of inevitability builds around you. And those benefactors, well, they never made explicit demands, but maybe you secretly already agreed with them. And if their desires contradict the public's or make it harder to keep your promises, that's just the price of doing business. Every prime minister has to make a deal with the devil, right? That's just normal in this country. And all these deals and all of these resources and all of these connections get you what you want. A huge landslide. And now the tension between the promises, the kind of connections you've made, and your more sincere beliefs, or the sincere beliefs of your staff, including the Epstein Associates protege, those all come tumbling out. Once you've won the election, everyone is looking at you thinking, what are they going to do? And they expect different things from you. If you followed the KIETH system so far, you have at least two sets of positions. A public-facing one, where you want to be a competent, uninspiring, but ultimately steady Prime Minister who incrementally improves things, and a private set of positions guided by the steady hand of the people around you and their particular interests. No matter which way you choose to go, you will inevitably stumble onto E, entirely fail to deliver. This is going to be tight. Let's see if we can fit this. I wrote fail in all caps. I don't know why that was my choice, but there you go. You come on to E. Entirely fail to deliver in all caps. I don't know why that was the choice I made, but it was the choice I made. Someone somewhere is going to be disappointed. That's the nature of playing both sides so that you always come out on top. Where some people might have expected a softer touch, you might clamp down on peaceful protest. Where people might have expected prices to stabilize and for wages to go up in real terms, oops, it turns out the Strait of Hormuz has been closed and we're providing support to our supposed allies in the operations that forced it closed and allowing America to strike at Iran using our bases, which makes us, by the way, an active participant in the illegal war that Israel and America launched. Others might have naively expected a more permissive attitude to issues like trans people's right to exist in society, or a basic anti-racist stance, or really any kind of fundamentally decent positioning at all. But using the KIETH system, you will deliver none of this. Instead, you will act as if you were a more hateful and pettier conservative government in its dying days, and everyone will think you failed them. Now, this step is where things can get a little complicated, because when I say trigger multiple crises, which I now have to write and didn't write very well, God, I can't believe how right my teachers were about handwriting being essential. This is the fucking last S here is incredible. The last S is not yeah, when you trigger multiple crises, as I've written, there are going to be two kinds of crises that you face. The first are crises caused by, following the first three steps here, whether it's energy, cost of living, climate, or politics more generally. There will just be a lot of political crises triggered by things like losing formerly safe seats to parties that have never won a by-election before, and maybe if the press think your failure to deliver is making them look bad and a set of convenient files are released by an allied government, they look into this Epstein associate who you've introduced and rewarded with a plum diplomatic role. One crisis can be considered unfortunate. Several cascading crises coming out one after the other, almost starting the moment you enter office. That looks like a you problem. And so in desperation, what can you do? And that's the second kind of crisis that you can trigger. You see, you might be regarded as a domestic failure, but foreign policy, maybe you've got a knack for it. I'm not sure that you have, but maybe you do. Now, part of the reason Starmer is considered by some to be good at foreign policy is because the orthodox foreign policy position in Britain is really easy, and British journalists are often very easily impressed by the fact that you've met someone they think is important. You go to the White House, you shake some hands, and suddenly the British press talk about how statesman-like you are. This is when you pull out your trump card, if you'll pardon the pun. You decide that actually what's happening is that a hostile country might attack us at any moment, and we need to rally around and do a series of devastating cuts in order to fund the military. Perhaps you justify this through pointing to an ongoing war in Europe. Perhaps America decides to destabilize the world. It doesn't really matter what the specifics are. This is a huge and highly risky move. Inviting a sense of crisis in an area where you've been in charge for over a year makes it hard to seem like you're the person to fix it. Instead of creating a rally round the flag effect, because the two broad positions in response to this are who's going to attack us, because honestly, unless it's France or Ireland, I'm not immediately concerned about it given the state and distance of some other potential adversaries. The other response is, it's never enough. We need more blood for the blood god and should immediately march on Moscow like Napoleon did. Somewhat ironic that the British military establishment wants to emulate Napoleon, but we'll have to leave that there for now. This manufactured sense of crisis backfires, and would backfire no matter what, which is why the British press have been losing their minds over a guy called Al Khan's while we've been waiting for Starmer to get out of office. This sense of crisis also brings us to the final part of the system. So what is your reward for all of this? Well, it's H. Halve Labour's, wow, this is not being written well either, polling. That's right, you halved it. That's what that says. While all of this has been going on, the thing that's been rumbling on in the background is that everyone except a dedicated core of largely retired, largely white, largely pro-EU people fucking hate you. It's one thing if Reform and Conservative voters hate you. They probably don't really factor into the damage you're doing to your own party. The problem is that the people who hate it the most, they're your voters, and every step along this path annoys more and more of them. They have their lines in different places. Some pessimists and factional types might have hated you all the way back when you were in the first step. I'm guilty as charged on that one. You only need to look at the other videos I've done to know that. Others may have noticed the presence of, the well-connected figures from the party's more centrist and war-crimey past around you and decided that was too much. A big chunk of them would be leaving when you're entirely failing to deliver. Wherever that line is, the fact of the matter is that by following this system, you have likely damaged one of the strongest brands in democratic politics beyond repair. Yes, you might be able to slap a northern accent on it for a few months and look like everything's coming back together, but there are some things, even a nice accent, and to be honest, Andy Burnham's accent isn't even that nice, can't fix. Look at you, Keir Starmer. You got to be king of the ashes, and you still had a big old cry in front of the country. There's no pleasing some people, is there?
The simplest form of my thesis on Starmer's project and the projects that fed into it is that they were doomed to fail from the start. Not just that they would be bad for the country, but manifestly unable to govern in any effective manner. Now, Keir Starmer in his resignation speech gave us a few clues that this project was never intended to govern, and really served as a perfect, self-contained summary of Starmer's time as Labour leader, just perhaps not in the way he intended it to be. Early on in his resignation speech, Starmer decided to attack his predecessor and the circumstances in which he inherited the party. He did so in the way that only he could, by lying. He called his party politically, financially, and morally bankrupt, none of which was true. When he became leader of the Labour Party, the finances were healthy. It's under his leadership that the party has become dependent on large donors to stay afloat. If Labour was politically bankrupt in the aftermath of the 2019 election, what might we call Starmer's Labour Party that recorded 500,000 fewer votes? And to speak of moral bankruptcy, when the roots of your political project had a hand in confecting that atmosphere, something we will get onto later in this video, is quite something. Especially given the scale of dishonesty, the corruption, and the frankly disgusting acts supporting genocide not just in Gaza, but in the UK against trans people, I was curious and decided to look at Tony Blair's resignation speech, the last Labour Prime Minister often compared to Starmer because they've both won huge landslides, a Prime Minister who was on the other side of participating in an illegal war, who had to have his hand forced by his own party into resigning. Admittedly, it was after 10 years that Blair had to resign, but what struck me was that Blair didn't attack his predecessors. He didn't complain and whinge about the circumstances in which he became leader and prime minister. Not once does he mention Neil Kinnock or John Smith or Michael Foot, because it would have been absurd. He had something to say for himself. He made what in the text appears to be a very sincere defense and explanation of why his government deviated so much from the promises of opposition. That isn't to say Blair was good, or that his government was good. He wasn't, and it wasn't. I grew up mostly under Blair, and let me tell you, it was shit then as well. It's just night and day between Starmer and Blair of 2007, because New Labour in 97 aspired to govern. Now, some may say that they were free to do that because the great sort of factional battles of Labour's past were settled in a way that it wasn't for Starmer. Which does bring us onto the part of his resignation speech that tells you what he really wanted to be doing as leader and what he was really doing, even after winning the election. But I know the question being asked now is not who was best placed to change the Labour Party to take us into power and to begin the vital work of improving lives for millions of people. Those questions have been answered. It's really weird how much he focuses on internal party dynamics while resigning as Prime Minister. He lists a series of achievements that, again, are largely founded on lies or tip his hand about what his project was really about, mainly getting to be big and important and standing next to the flag. When he said ripping out the poison of anti-Semitism, restoring trust on the economy, defense, and national security, which, by the way, weird to put all of those things together. I'm just throwing that out there. But what that really means is standing with Israel through its genocide, supporting austerity, and funneling whatever money you can hack out of the welfare state to American military contractors. That is the legacy of his project, and it's very interesting what he thinks his achievements were once he got into government. He listed them off. I watched this speech live and I couldn't quite believe what he was saying, because the list of things he brought up, once you sifted through the platitudes, largely fell into one of three categories: outright lies, things that are bad, and actions he was initially opposed to upon taking office. It was a masterclass in self-deception if he believed these things, and these things had set him apart in any meaningful way from any other prime minister. What the resignation speech did was really tell us everything we needed to know about Keir Starmer as a person that led to him being put through public humiliation after public humiliation before unceremoniously being kicked out of office. I think it's obvious I don't think much of Starmer's resignation speech. It came across as a load of self-pitying bullshit where he had a big whinge in front of the country about how hard his life's been. If I was being honest, I would say there's no better summary of Keir Starmer's time as Labour leader and Prime Minister than getting the world's press to watch him complain about Jeremy Corbyn, scold the country and his party for being ingrates, and then have a big old cry. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with him crying or showing emotion, but the petty person in me loved seeing it happen. It was immensely satisfying because no one in Britain deserves to be in that state more than Keir Starmer. He was a bitter, small-time, factional prick right up until the last, and in some ways I can respect being true to yourself. It's just not the character of someone who is ever going to succeed as Prime Minister. And look, it told you everything you needed to know about him. My take on Starmer's project and how we ended up here is that it was not built to succeed in government. From its inception, it was wrong. There was something artificial and off-putting about it. I would compare it to how some sweeteners used in soft drinks may taste fine, but they give me headaches. Now, I was opposed to it from the start, so I would think this, wouldn't I? I can justify it though. The fact that Starmer's project relied on dishonesty in order to take control of his party, his 10 pledges that were quickly abandoned, was how a lot of the country was introduced to him. And while there's a general disdain for politicians and an assumption they're lying, it's quite something for a politician and their associated project to be so nakedly dishonest. This dishonesty, combined with the fact that the key pillars of this project and its primary internal source of support, the think tank Labour Together, helmed by Starmer's former chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, used this deception to engage in factional warfare within their own party while surrendering on every point of principle, really did not endear Starmer or his project to the country. When journalists analysed Labour's victory in the 2024 election, a lot of the press wrote the story that they wanted to write about it, which we'll talk about a little bit in more detail, but was essentially a story of a country that had craved moderation and rejected the left and also the right, but to a lesser extent, because, you know, we'll need to sort of bring them back. But that is kind of funny given who was in government at the time. If we ever get the complete story, I would think that what's happened was that the country was basically held hostage by the Labour right and their allies in the press until the country relented and finally let them have a go at government. In fact, as we'll see, I think there's more than enough evidence to suggest that this was the case already out there. The fundamental nature of Starmer's project meant it could never be converted into a successful governing project. It was too invested in its real mission. Starmer always had this subtle feeling of a man who was heading to government by accident and didn't seem to believe it was really going to happen, which perhaps explains why he and his team made no plans for government, at least according to the reporting. I actually have some doubts about this and think it lets them off the hook for their very bad politics. Starmer's project was a kind of cargo cult Blairism, where they engaged in the rituals that they believed would lead to both winning the election and successful government. Unfortunately, this ran into the problem of it not being 1997 anymore. The conditions that allowed Blairism to have any successes simply weren't there in 2024, and often despite being second and third generation Blairites, the people around Starmer didn't really understand how Tony Blair achieved what he did. For one, whatever you may think of him, Blair never hid who he was politically. You may not have liked him. You may think his government was awful for this country and for people outside of this country, but he knew who he was and he argued for it. When he won the leadership of his party, there was no shady think tank assisting him with polling commissioned with undeclared donations. Even if Starmer had inherited the conditions that made Blairism successful, he would still have failed. Fundamentally, his character and factional obsessions made him unable to escape the fact that he was a petty little man who only seemed to enjoy wielding the force of the British state at those unable to hit back. Like those people he jailed for what were often very minor crimes, like stealing bottles of water from Lidl when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. It's hard to sustain an image both as Mr. Rules, the tough guy prosecutor, while obviously holding yourself to a different standard. This incoherence, both politically and personally, between his projected personas and the reality of who he is, meant that instead of people projecting what they wanted onto him, they would project their worst assumptions onto him. And at a certain point, a project founded on that level of dishonesty, with no charisma behind it and no real tangible delivery, was always going to crash and burn. We can finally start drilling into what the point of Starmer being Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party was. But in order to do so, we need to understand what political groups and forces his leadership drew upon and relied on. Any party leadership is going to be a coalition of interests, and Starmer's was no exception. And it's in who was backing him that we can find some clues as to where things began to go off the rails. Keir Starmer won the 2020 Labour leadership election with just over 56% of the first preference votes, which shows, if nothing else, that Starmer's campaign had a good understanding of who the Labour membership were and how to appeal to them. We'll talk a little bit more about how his campaign may have been able to do that, but it's also the case that his campaign was very well funded. I didn't keep it, I kind of wish I had, but Starmer sent out a poster of his face to every Labour member at the time, which must have cost a fair bit. This broad support indicates that he won what's commonly known as the soft left, which usually constitutes the majority of Labour members. Now, this is different from the people who sort of actively self-identify as soft left in the context of the Labour membership. I would describe them as the mirror of the typical Tory member. They're opposed to bad things and in favour of good things. If you were a member of Labour at any point, you'll almost certainly have heard a variation of socialism is when you're nice to people, or something like that. I know I did, and it took everything in me not to roll my eyes so hard I detached my retinas, but this is who the bulk of Labour members have always been. They want good things and not bad things. Which, you know, fair enough. But if you look at the list of MPs who endorsed Keir Starmer in that leadership election, you see a range of names, from the parliamentary soft left, a more ideologically focused expression of the I want the good things but not bad things, though, you know, they usually end up supporting the bad things because they're fundamentally a very cowardly grouping. But also you see figures quite strongly associated with the Labour right and none associated with Labour's left. Pretty much the only unifying factor I could find was that a lot of these MPs were very vocally pro-Remain, and some of them, for a variety of reasons, really fixated on that issue. Now, there's a reason why the Labour right is perhaps poorly represented in Starmer's nominations, which is that a lot of the more odious and aggressively ideological ones had nominated Jess Phillips, who would go on to sort of flounce out of the contest because she got owned in the one hustings she attended. At the start, he had quite a broad set of interests represented in both in his parliamentary support, his initial shadow cabinet, and his staff. As time went on, this narrowed. Members of staff who were loosely associated with the left, though I would characterise them as more pro-EU than left-wing, but that's my hang-up, and I'm not saying you have to accept that, would gradually leave and call Starmer all sorts of things. There's some debate to be had as to whether Starmer's political instincts being quite bad and inclined to defer to power led to him pushing out any remotely left-leaning figures, thus making him more reliant on the Labour right, or whether this was the plan all along. Regardless, you eventually had a team dominated by figures like Morgan McSweeney, factional warriors whose main aim was fighting internal battles rather than governing, or using all of the talents available at the time to construct an agenda for governing. So as time went on, Starmer's leadership became increasingly dependent on the Labour right. This process was particularly accelerated in the wake of the local elections in 2021 and the Hartlepool by-election, which produced an all-time Keir Starmer quote where he said that change meant changing the things that need changing. In fact, here you go. One last time, here is the clip to prove that he really did say this.
Looking internally and facing the country and setting out that bold vision for a better Britain and changing the things that need changing.
What is that vision?
That is the change that I will bring about.
It has been suggested that Starmer was on the verge of quitting after these local elections and the by-election. He was persuaded to stay, and after this, he was no longer in the unity business, and his top team would be reshuffled in a way that indicated this, with the promotion of much more right-wing figures like Rachel Reeves becoming Shadow Chancellor, a woman who said that Labour doesn't want to represent people who are out of work. A sentiment that caused quite a lot of understandable anger and is the kind that precipitated the backlash that triggered the Labour right's relative marginalisation in Labour from 2015 to 2019. This marginalisation came in the form of then Labour outsider Jeremy Corbyn winning the 2015 leadership, which was a bizarre time to say the least. I remember I was in Turkey for some of that summer, and which is when the leadership election was happening, and it was a spectacle to say the least, even from way over there. Like, it was hard not to sort of keep up with it. It's easy to forget, but the Labour right publicly waged an extremely bitter campaign against their own party for the best part of half a decade. Really, this would deserve a video of its own to do it justice, but it was quite frankly bizarre how angry and entitled a lot of Labour MPs and their hangers-on got during this period. A lot of quite junior Labour right MPs found that they were able to get quite positive media coverage, provided they were willing to badmouth their own party and their own party leadership and their own party members. Some of them took that opportunity and ran with it. Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips are particular examples that come to mind. This is not really an environment that creates good habits, one where infighting and backstabbing are rewarded with good media coverage, especially when that infighting is targeting the left. This tendency that grew more and more emboldened in their ridiculous antics ended up taking over the party from this point through Starmer's leadership. Now, there's an open question again as to whether Starmer was a true believer in the Labour rights cause. There's evidence to suggest that at the local level he was, or whether he simply managed to contort himself into dependence on this faction. Regardless, the result is the same. The party had a leader who was under the thrall of a faction who was determined to exact vengeance for their careers being briefly impeded, largely by their own refusal, by the way, to work with a left-wing leadership, and who believed they had a righteous fury to deploy against the left for preventing the UK from getting the government they needed. This is despite them having a hand in preventing their own party from winning at least 2 elections. There's a telling quote about how under the control of this faction Starmer seemed to be, which is found in Get In by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund. Keir's not driving the train. He thinks he's driving the train, but we've sat him at the front of the DLR. Now, for those of you who don't know, the DLR is a driverless train. This faction's drive towards vengeance and indulgence of its worst instincts set it up as the worst possible group to be in charge of the party, with a leader who was so weak and reliant on external support. This was a project whose whole purpose became repudiation of the left, and it was obvious. I actually did a video in December of 2022 in response to an Owen Jones video where he was saying he would still vote Labour at this time, where I pointed out that to vote for Labour as a leftist would be to vote for your own marginalisation. Not to pick on Owen Jones, he's moved on from that position in the meantime, but it was pretty obvious even then what this was. Everything this faction was doing was to desperately prove the mantra that elections are only one from the centre. That the Tories would manage to implode after so long in government and hand it to them like they did to Blair during the 92 to 97 Parliament. Part of this cargo cult Blairism they're engaging in, and what they wanted to do was to be able to write the history by simply winning. Part of how they got to do that was with the assistance of our esteemed media, who really took it very easy on Starmer. Like, I don't think there's any other leader who would have got away with release the sausages. It's rather challenging to talk about the British press as partisan actors in politics, because people often adopt whatever position is convenient about them being this. I'm consistent about this. At all levels, the British press is influenced by who they hire and what habits they encourage into becoming partisan actors. It's not a force of nature, but made up of people reacting to incentives and who know what gets published and what doesn't. Especially opinion journalists, the act of what stories get prominence and what doesn't, all of it is part of how the press acts in a partisan manner. A lot of Starmer's dwindling band of supporters have elegantly shifted from the notion that navigating the British press is an essential skill and it sucks to suck if your preferred politician struggles, to now claiming that the British press have had it in for him all along. Again, think about releasing the sausages. The truth is that if you look at how the British press has conducted itself when his predecessor was Labour leader, especially if you compare their coverage of the 2017 and 2019 elections, that they were invested in defeating a left-led Labour Party. More than that, they were invested in proving that it was non-viable to be remotely left of centre electorally. You'll notice that this narrative they wanted to construct has significant overlap with that of the Labour right, who had come to control Starmer's leadership. One of the things that we need to come to terms with is how little scrutiny Starmer invited, despite being a figure for whom there was ample material to use in order to make him a controversial figure. I'm not going to rehash everything I said in that first video that I did about him, but the length of that video alone points to this being a rich area you could dig into if you were the press. This is speculation on my part, but I believe that this lack of scrutiny had a purpose: to propel him into Downing Street once it had become obvious that the Tories were finished as a governing project. Partially, this would have been motivated by the British press's sort of insatiable desire for access to government, but equally, I think, we could say the lack of scrutiny Starmer attracted was in part because the press realised that Starmer's victory would be a useful tool for them. So they weren't all that interested in applying scrutiny until they were somewhat compelled to by a general election and then entering government. The closest we got to Starmer getting the sort of full British press treatment that his predecessors as Labour leader got was during the scandal around gifts that MPs had received. And even then, that scrutiny was only really intense because MPs kept going out in front of cameras and insisting they had a God-given right to accept free Taylor Swift tickets. This absence of scrutiny is precisely what led to the farce of Starmer collapsing once the reality of government hit, where there was clearly no plan in terms of how to govern or what his priorities really were, aside from making his government an extension of the factional narrative his backers wanted it to be. Once they were in government, it became really clear that they wouldn't abandon this factional attitude. Really, it looked at times as if Starmer and his cabinet looked at a given situation and asked, what's the opposite of what Jeremy Corbyn would do? And this goes some way to explaining why they appeared to be in perfect continuity with the Tory government that they took power from. A Tory government that looked exhausted. It's actually really interesting how quickly Starmer's government looked out of ideas at times. One might suggest that this is the natural result of having a hard right factional warrior like Morgan McSweeney calling the shots, but the rot was very much deeper than that. This lack of ideas often led to the targeting of causes and groups associated with the left. Now, I'm using quotations there because I don't think that's true in these cases, and it's actually a really nasty way to think about what I'm about to talk about. Some examples I would point to are trans people, Palestine, universities, immigrants. Weirdly, Rachel Reeves took it upon herself also to attack newts and wildlife in the name of house building, which I would actually say is an element of the government that's not looked at enough. British people may resent environmentalists to some extent and some aspects of environmentalism, but callousness towards wildlife is usually a red line for a lot of very middle-of-the-road people. It comes across as deeply unpleasant, alongside all of the issues, of course, which alienated different segments of the public beyond the left. All of this unpleasantness, particularly towards vulnerable groups, really contributed to the collapse of the project, but it had a purpose. It was about belittling and demonstrating power over groups and causes associated with their enemies, and this created a tension, one I described in my video about Labour's right-wing turn, where the socially conservative, transphobic, racist attitudes can't really coexist with meaningfully left-of-centre political instincts generally. In seeking to punch left, they pushed themselves further right, and by doing so they made their own project less and less coherent and precipitated its total collapse. This doesn't mean that this won't be repeated, even though it's so obvious. In fact, I suspect Andy Burnham will likely continue in this way, but it's blindingly obvious that the desire not just to distinguish themselves from a preceding leadership, but to bury any and everything to do with it, led to them spiraling into disaster. Given how much of a news item he's been and his role in causing the collapse of Starmer's government, I wonder how much of an introduction Peter Mandelson really needs. He has, in some form or another, been a major figure within Labour for longer than I've been alive. He's also the bitter, vengeful, factional spirit of the Labour right given human form. He very famously said that he worked every day to undermine Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. If I could point to a single person who seemed to get everything they wanted out of the Starmer project, it would be hard to find a better candidate than Peter Mandelson, who got the anti-left factional warfare he'd been engaging in to be the official policy of a leadership guided, to put it mildly, by his supposed protege, Morgan McSweeney. It seems no matter what period of Labour history you look at, since the late 80s, Mandelson is there, looming in the background. In that way, he reminds me of Jar Jar Binks, in that he does seem to be the key to all of this, but also was close personal friends with someone who harmed children. It just seems odd for such an obvious liability to be present in so many moments. Mandelson was very much a known quantity by the time Keir Starmer had drawn up his shortlist for US ambassador. A list that apparently also contained George Osborne, the architect of the Tories' austerity policy, and Bear Grylls, which, honestly, that one I kind of struggle to wrap my head around. I've written what's basically a book's worth of content about Starmer, and I still can't quite produce a theory that feels credible to explain how Bear Grylls made it onto the list, other than to, I don't know, maybe make Mandelson look marginally less absurd as a choice. If it wasn't for the fact that he had simply become too much of an embarrassment for the British press and for Keir Starmer, Peter Mandelson would have been one of the few people in the country to say they got everything they wanted out of the past 30 years. He became firmly embedded with the elite and would, as US ambassador, have had ample opportunity to make even more lucrative connections. That is the fundamental character that you need to understand with Peter Mandelson. He is New Labour, cronyism, factionalism, and corruption made flesh, truly a man who couldn't resist an opportunity to line his pockets or to ingratiate himself to some rich person in order to get their favour. Mandelson's flaws, and that's being polite about it, were common knowledge. He had a very colourful career before his appointment as ambassador to the US, and his association with Jeffrey Epstein was, as I said earlier, public knowledge. So why was he seemingly so important that Keir Starmer, or maybe the people around him, felt he should have been anywhere? Like, first of all, anywhere, but anywhere near a lucrative ambassadorship. This is arguably the decision that made people realize Starmer had to go. The thing that baffles me is that it was so obvious that this would end in tears. Not that you'd know it from some of the press coverage, which, while cautious, framing it as a gamble, did tend to fall on the side of this decision being one that could pay off. This was particularly concentrated in journalists whose careers included the New Labour period, though not all of them, of course, which speaks to how well connected Peter Mandelson was, maybe still is, that there were journalists willing to bat for him despite every occasion of him being awarded a position with responsibility, ending in him resigning either as a failure or a disgrace. Once the Epstein files were released and the scale of his relationship with Epstein became clear, then he became too embarrassing and the press turned on him. A sensible Prime Minister would have avoided appointing a known associate of Epstein as US ambassador, with or without developed vetting, which Mandelson had failed, despite Starmer's insistence that it somehow didn't matter. I find it very hard to believe that Starmer could have been unaware of who Peter Mandelson was. I just can't see it. He must have picked up a newspaper in the 2000s. If a YouTuber can easily find pictures of Mandelson hanging out with Epstein that predate Gen AI, then surely the Prime Minister or his Chief of Staff or someone could have asked, "Are we sure this is a good idea?" I don't want to rehash the entire Mandelson saga, but Starmer defended him until very late in the day. And this is speculation, but I suspect that a lot of the reluctance to sack him and the decision to appoint him in the first place is down to two reasons. One is Starmer, because he's not living under a rock, thought that Mandelson and Trump having a common link to Epstein would yield some kind of diplomatic advantage. Now, of course, Starmer or McSweeney or whoever couldn't say that on the grounds that it's absolutely outrageous and would have led to an even faster deterioration of Starmer's position, but it does seem to be obvious as an answer as to how he gets into that position, especially when you consider that there was already a well-liked and reportedly quite competent ambassador in place. Starmer wanted to make a political appointment, and that leads me to my second bit of speculation that seeks to answer the broader question. I spent a lot of time trying to find a purpose to Starmer's project as I was working on this script, and of course, anti-left partisanship is a big factor. The purpose of Starmer's project had to be connected to why it failed so quickly. I genuinely didn't want to say that the purpose was to reward people for services rendered. Mandelson wasn't shy about his attempts to undermine Starmer's predecessor, actions that Starmer directly benefited from. And so you have to ask, was this a show of gratitude, especially where McSweeney was concerned, repaying his mentor? Now, we'll never really be able to know for sure. I doubt that there will be a smoking gun found in this regard. The most that we know is that the government, led by Starmer through McSweeney, really wanted Mandelson to be US ambassador, despite everything that was in the public domain at the time. They wanted the process expedited, as Morgan McSweeney admitted. Pressure was put on officials to do this. Why do this if it was just trying to get the best person for the job in the role? Again, speculation. We're going to do some more speculation. But when you take in the way Senior figures in the party accepted gifts, including Starmer. When you look at the post-politics careers of many Labour figures, often into lucrative positions, you can't help but wonder if all of this was a means not just to preserve the political power of a faction within a party, but to keep access to the lucrative connections and opportunities open. Peter Mandelson is by no means unique as a corrupted political figure. His connection to Epstein makes him an easy target, and the fact that Starmer had staked so much political capital on him makes him a great case study for this video. Mandelson's presence didn't just signal that their purpose was to prosecute a vicious factional conflict, but to reward loyalists and those who put in a shift to achieve this. In some ways, that makes Starmer's project a very normal political project, but it does carry with it the stain of corruption and of association with Jeffrey Epstein. Mandelson's reward was intended as both insult and injury. I can only say that I'm glad Starmer looked like a fool defending him the day before his hand was forced and he sacked him. It knocked out a key pillar of his project, with McSweeney taking the fall, which brings us neatly onto the meat of what Starmer's project was really about. I want to talk about a particular book, The Fraud by Paul Holden. It is one of 5 books I've read about Keir Starmer and his leadership of the Labour Party that I think have shaped my understanding of it. 2 of them are more biographical, and 3 of them are more like The Fraud, attempting to document what Starmer's political project was up to behind closed doors. Those 5 books, for those wondering, are Oliver Eagleton's The Starmer Project, which was a significant source I used in the first video I did about Keir Starmer, because it was one of the few sources that had a significant portion of itself dedicated to Starmer's pre-politics career from an oppositional perspective. The other is Tom Baldwin's biography of Starmer, which is probably the least interesting one of the bunch, but the interesting thing about it is seeing Starmer from the perspective of someone who clearly admires him and just believes he can never do anything wrong. Those 2 are more biographical. The other 3 are more interesting for our purposes because they try to set out what the supporting structure around Starmer looked like and what that meant for how his leadership proceeded. Those 3 books, including The Fraud, are Get In by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, and Taken as Read by Anushka Astana. The interesting thing about these books is that they largely cover a lot of the same ground. Of these, I would recommend The Fraud. It's probably the only one that you really need to read. It's also the most recently published. In fact, it was published quite close to one of the rounds of the Mandelson controversy, if I recall correctly, which means it will be the most up-to-date, but I also recommend it because it takes a condemnatory position on the frankly unacceptable conduct it describes. That's described across all 3 books, which is that Starmer's rise to Labour leader and Prime Minister was achieved with the backing of a duplicitous and frankly borderline criminal think tank called Labour Together, which was helmed by Morgan McSweeney. A think tank that worked with the press, right-wing Labour MPs, and celebrities through astroturfed groups to produce outcomes that directly benefited Starmer and provided the foundation of his political project while publicly presenting itself as a unifying force within the party. The other 2 books that cover this are interesting and are referred to in The Fraud, though not always in a complimentary way. All of the authors of those books are professional political journalists, and some of the anecdotes include one about a dinner hosted by Labour Together, which was an attempt to ingratiate their think tank to The Guardian as part of a broader strategy to destroy The Canary, a left-wing news website, which was described as schmooze The Guardian, kill The Canary. That suggests to me that it's not really plausible that these political journalists were wholly unaware of what was happening, and that it might have merited some reporting with their platforms exactly what was going on at the time, or had happened. This is more an issue with the genre of insider story politics books that really would merit its own video. I find it amusing that the tones Gitin and Taken as Read take come off as an attempt to be dispassionate observers, while obviously being parties to this in some fashion. One thing I will say about The Fraud that I enjoyed is that it did cover a lot of the same ground as I have in a lot of my other videos, so that's nice and a bit validating, but it is the most robust analysis of those events. And while I've seen criticism of Paul Holden as being a partisan or to opposition, and it's clear that being a hater has helped him construct this comprehensive takedown of the two separate projects he defines, the Labour Together project and the Starmer project. Labour Together was founded as an almost sickeningly sincere project that sought to keep the party together in the aftermath of their defeat in 2015 and produce a viable and almost non-factional route back to power for the party. It was eventually taken over by Morgan McSweeney. Morgan McSweeney actually sought to reassure Jeremy Corbyn in a 2019 meeting that the project meant his leadership no harm, which is an unfortunate thing to have fallen for, but also speaks to how clandestine the group's involvement in various issues were at the time. It had acquired a significant war chest of donations that it hadn't declared, breaking the law, meaning one of the key pillars of Starmer's leadership was in effect a criminal enterprise. Labour Together used these resources to exacerbate existing issues for the left-led Labour Party and its leadership of the time, and tried to create an alternative media ecosystem of basically centrist podcasts and influencers, which is an amusing thing to have attempted in a field where authenticity is the key to success. The well-publicised anti-Semitism crisis in Labour was in part exacerbated by Labour Together's intervention. They seeded a series of stories that were picked up on by the mainstream press. A notable example that I actually remember was the Corbyn's Hate Factories story, which centered on the conduct of people in Facebook groups and essentially held the leadership responsible for the conduct of potentially random members of the public, a standard that I would argue is almost impossible to meet if you have an organization, group, or community of more than maybe a couple thousand. I spoke earlier of the collusion between the press and Starmer's project, and the fact that Labour Together's hand in seeding these stories was hidden, or at least not looked into, is an example of how this functioned in practice. I'm not accusing anyone of deliberately hiding anything as such, but a convenient lack of curiosity, perhaps? That seems entirely plausible to me, especially when at the time, this kind of reporting was very likely to get published and was a very good way to make a reputation for yourself in the mainstream press. Labour Together also had a hand in the creation of Stop Funding Fake News, an AstroTurf organisation that went after left-wing media outlet The Canary, with the intention of denying it advertising revenue under the pretext of combating misinformation, effectively killing it as a viable outlet, whether you liked their output or not. They were a very popular outlet among people on the left for a time, and they suddenly seemed to disappear, and this goes some way to explaining why. There's a lot more I could go into, but I would say, just read the book, because I can't just read the book to you in this video, because that's not really fair on Paul Holden or on you, because you don't want me to read an audiobook to you. But my point in highlighting all of this is that Keir Starmer's leadership campaign benefited from the resources and actions that Labour Together had accrued and engaged in. Resources and actions that were gathered and executed under subterfuge. A fundamentally factional and dishonest project which created the core of why Starmer's leadership panned out the way it did. Labour's poor response to Gaza, for example, could be put down to it being pre-disciplined by the anti-Semitism crisis that Labour Together had a hand in exacerbating. In fact, there's at least one article where this is the precise argument made about Labour's response to Israel's escalation of their genocide in Palestine. Labour's internal attitude towards minorities other than Jewish people is also somewhat explained by this foundation, since Muslim and black members of the Labour Party, for various reasons, tend to sit closer to the party's left a lot of the time. It goes back to what I said about targeting groups of people on the basis of perceived closeness to the left, which also explains why the Ford report, which was convened in the aftermath of a leaked report that contained evidence of extreme racism among Labour staff, was ignored. It was basically ignored. As I said, I don't want to just read the book to you because this is all in there, so I'm going to try to summarise the relevant parts of it for us. Starmer's project was formed out of Labour Together, who seemed to pick him out as their figurehead because they understood him to be someone who would just go along with what they wanted, who lacked any internality. This means that the well-documented dishonesty of Starmer and his surrounding project can be traced back to this organisation, which at best was nakedly dishonest and at worst was a criminal enterprise that encouraged criminality among its allies and acolytes, including the use of illegally obtained data to pursue factional opponents, as happened in the notoriously corrupt London borough of Croydon. This was a project who interfered in the normal function of democracy on behalf of an apparently corrupt, criminal, and deeply unpopular sect within one political party, a sect that was aligned to the interest of big donors and the establishment. They could only gain any kind of democratic consent through deception, and it appears this was quite well known among quite a few people, which leads to a lot of questions that might be uncomfortable. The extent of the hijacking is made clear in how many of the candidates at the 2024 general election were essentially picked by McSweeney, something I actually talked about in that first video I did on Keir Starmer, but with no reference to McSweeney, since at the time that wasn't really a thing that was strictly known about in the public domain. The parachuting of right-wing national executive members into parliamentary seats was a clue that something of this nature was happening. A good example of this is the tomato-egg hybrid Luke Akehurst, who was parachuted into the seat of North Durham, a man who believes that the UK should have entered the Vietnam War on the side of America. And I just highlight this because they call people like me an extremist and fringe, and I'm just not going to take that from these people, to be honest. This is all important for us to understand in the context of how they have chosen to govern, both the party they've taken control of and the country at large. I would characterize the actions of Starmer in government and in charge of his party as fundamentally at odds with democracy. He's had the bearing of a control freak stepdad his whole time as Labour leader, and it shows in how acquiescent he was to Tory authoritarian legislation and how willing he's been to introduce legislation that is a similar civil liberty nightmare. Starmer's very ascent as Labour leader was facilitated by a group that seemed to participate in the undermining of the major opposition party in a two-party democracy, while operating within that same party. The leaked report that led to the Ford report also contained details of staff deliberately seeking to alter election resourcing in a way that favoured their preferred, usually right-wing candidates, at the expense of pursuing a potentially more effective targeting strategy, especially as the polls narrowed in the 2017 election. Something that may have impacted the outcome of the election, given some of the fine margins at play and the claims about how many resources may have been taken up by this scheme. And I find it to be plausible. I find all of this to be plausible. What I'm essentially saying is that a bureaucratic and right-wing faction that aligned itself with Starmer's project deliberately tried to lose an election. His very presence is a crisis in British democracy, especially since he seems to be escaping scrutiny now he's resigned, when in a country that valued democracy, he would probably be arrested. Starmer, McSweeney, Labour Together, and the journalists aligned to them have left lasting damage on the institutions of British democracy. Imperfect though it may be, it's a bad sign that the system itself seems unwilling to disincentivize lying, corruption, and cheating, seemingly preferring its own gradual fading into nothing over a government that might raise taxes on the rich a little. If the kinds of things documented in the fraud, the other books on Starmer's leadership, and really a lot of things that are just openly reported on by the press that is clearly too close to their subjects had happened in a country in the global south, we would have a different language to describe it. In fact, if that country had oil, I suspect America would be trying to invade it right this second. We would use words like hybrid regime to describe a country like this, where the main opposition has a faction within it that deliberately loses in order to prop up a government that was slowly in collapse. We would recognize this for what it was, a suspension of British democracy. And I know that sounds dramatic, but let me ask you this. Does British democracy feel healthier and more responsive to the public's needs than it did in 2017? If I might be allowed a bit of dramatic license, I would characterize the takeover of the country by a faction that deliberately sought to keep an obviously unfit incumbent government in place just long enough for them to take over their own party, and then for the country to finally get sick of them as a coup. Certainly an outrage and a transgression of democratic norms, and the culprits have got away with it. This anti-democratic, almost resentful attitude towards democratic participation also molded the kind of victory they wanted to win at the general election. They sought an efficient victory, and you could argue they got it, but there was no love in that landslide. When people look at Starmer's loveless landslide in the 2024 election, there are usually two routes people go down. One often favoured by his supporters and the press, where they fixate on the number of seats and his margin of victory over the Tories, which I've never had a particular issue with, because you can only beat what's in front of you. I don't begrudge them the victory in and of itself, but more what being able to win a landslide majority with the lowest winning percentage since universal suffrage says about the political system as a whole. That neatly brings us to the second approach, which is to look at the raw number of votes, the low turnout, and the relatively low winning percentage, and point to this meaning Starmer was going to face immediate challenges as Prime Minister. That he wouldn't have the traditional honeymoon period an election-winning Prime Minister usually has and expects because of the nature of his victory. It wasn't just that their winning percentage was low or that they got fewer votes than they had in the 2019 election. As I said, you can only beat what's in front of you, and Starmer had the benefit of facing Rishi Sunak, a man who seemed determined to lose that election. Labour won a significant number of seats on low vote shares and narrow majorities. Labour won 26 seats by fewer than 1,000 votes and 51 by a margin of 5% or less. Only one of those seats was won with more than 40% of the vote for Labour, a sign of how fragmented Britain's electorate had become in this election, illustrated by a number of seats, particularly by Liz Truss's former seat, where Labour won with just 26.7% of the vote. Certainly an improvement on Labour's previous performance in the seat, but one that in years gone by would have yielded, at best, a very poor second place. These results provide a clue as to what the problem would be for Labour as they went on. A project that was helmed by people who wanted to shake off the fleas, code for tell their core voters to fuck off, were in possession of an electoral coalition that was already fragmenting before they had a chance to govern. Their victory, one where the only thing that mattered was that they beat what was in front of them with no regard as to what the manner of that victory would mean for governing. Because as we've discussed, it's pretty evident that there was no plan for what happened once they got into government. And all they really wanted to achieve was the victory that would craft the narrative they wanted, and justifying the only thing they really did have any instinct for, which was weaponizing the force multipliers inherent in holding power against those less powerful than them who they thought were aligned with their enemies. The 2024 election could not have gone better for Labour Together or Starmer. It was a low engagement, low information affair playing out in front of a country that was frankly exhausted by politics. It's hard not to say that a significant component of that exhaustion was encouraged by Starmer before the election and was encouraged by Labour Together when they were seeding stories that would become major news narratives prior to the 2019 election. The way I would describe the conduct of the faction behind Starmer is that they basically held the country hostage by deliberately kneecapping any alternative and colluding with the press to get Boris Johnson and his diamond-hard Brexit over the line. The country was not just sick of the Tories, but they were also sick of Labour and got more sick of them as the campaign went on. Labour's polling had until recently been on a pretty much constant decline since the election was called. It's somewhat funny that Starmer has consistently been the most popular with Lib Dem voters because the political leader he most resembles is Jo Swinson, who became less and less popular the more the public saw of her. Now, she never became Prime Minister, despite her party insisting that she could be, so we will never know if she could have converted her absurd project into a functional government, but given Starmer's leadership was backed by people with largely the same motivations, I think we could safely say it wouldn't have ended well. Plus, she lost her seat anyway, so that's kind of funny. I mean, probably the funniest thing she ever did. The 2024 election being so low engagement and low information meant that Labour could effectively play it in the most boring way imaginable. Not to promise too much, but they did, as we'll recall, keep promising things, and of course, we got to hear about what Starmer's dad did for a living, which led to this victory where several MPs are sitting on very weak personal mandates and very narrow majorities, which creates a tension. A lot of these new MPs know they're not in all likelihood going to be MPs for very long, and that changes the dynamics of government. Something I doubt Starmer planned for, but it's clear given some of the wide-ranging proclamations some of the 2024 intake have been engaging in, such as Al Khan's pretending he could have been a serious leadership prospect when he's basically barely able to construct an argument and only impressive to the British press. It's clear that managing his party would be tough for Starmer even if he was doing well despite the massive majority, and Starmer did not do well. These narrow majorities and the manner of Labour's victory were often lauded under the term electoral efficiency, namely that instead of stacking up votes in traditional safe seats, Labour's gains were concentrated in the seats it needed to win. There's like a little bit of credibility to that. Certainly if you look at Labour's target seats, they gained a lot more in those seats than they did in other seats, such as Lib Dem target seats. Labour don't really make any gains there. There was an element of tactical voting at play, which you can see in the scale of the Tory defeat since they were caught in a perfect storm of anti-Tory tactical voting, and a split of the right-wing vote would reform. It is striking then that under these circumstances, where Labour clearly sought to shadow the Tories and neglect both its core voters on the left and Starmer's biggest supporters, the sort of Remainer liberal cohort who were largely apolitical before 2016. These circumstances and the voters they neglected under the assumption that they had nowhere to go meant that they were unable to avoid significant losses, losing 5 seats to independents, suffering massively reduced majorities in traditional Labour seats, and I don't mean the red wall, like the bullshit red wall of 2019, I mean real Labour heartlands, the ones that have stuck with the party through thick and thin. I simply ask you, can a party that not only neglects, but goes on to basically insult its core voters, their core beliefs, can it really avoid falling to historic levels of unpopularity The warning signs were there in the electoral efficiency. It's self-aligned that's dripping with cope, because you just know if they'd won with 40% of the national vote share, they wouldn't be resorting to electoral efficiency and would be lauding the astonishing majorities they won across the country. An already fragmenting electoral coalition who they insulted in opposition and would go on to not just insult, but actively seek to repress in government, has to be understood in the context of the motivations behind the project, namely to repudiate the left and to punish groups they saw as aligned to it. But also must be understood as the reason Starmer couldn't succeed. His purpose was incompatible with any form of governing, any kind of meaningful victory, and the electorate's fury, eventually, one that was already prepared in a lot of places to punish his party, caught up with him. There's a real temptation and satisfaction you can derive by pinning everything that's gone wrong on that pig Keir Starmer, or looking at the project behind him and their prominent figures like Morgan McSweeney. It's comforting to think that all of this is caused by bad people being in the wrong place, and you won't find me arguing that there's something true about that analysis. Starmer was clearly, from the early days of his leadership, an unfit person to be Prime Minister, and McSweeney is, by all the available evidence, a duplicitous snake who manipulated and cheated his way to his right-wing faction holding an almost unbreakable grip on the country's traditional centre-left party. All of this being said, they're not root causes. McSweeney is a second-generation Blairite, and Keir Starmer is, if descriptions of him are to be believed, a useful idiot who mostly enjoyed getting to sit in the big chair. They are products of an environment, and their rise to positions of influence are down to a system that's basically been in free fall since at least the financial crash, if not earlier. In 2008, the Thatcherite consensus had clearly imploded and caused maximum damage to this country, and any reasonable person would have looked at that and said, okay, let's move on. Instead, we've been plagued by a series of governments, prime ministers, and influential members of staff, and a press who have insisted that we try to keep this show on the road, despite the wheels very clearly falling off. And part of the reason this was allowed to happen and alternatives were suppressed is because this mode of doing politics, of understanding the economy, had come to find a way into all of the major parties. They also clearly feel entitled to control of all of the major parties too. The evidence points to there being a group of people in the Labour Party who felt not just that their politics and their outlook was the best for the country and for the party, but who felt that they were entitled to control the party. These people also exist in the Conservative Party, but they seem to have taken more of a beating than their Labour equivalents. I can't help but think of the notorious Independent Group for Change, or CUPTIGs, as essentially a tantrum about their faction not being in control and having nothing to offer. To the extent that this group has a part of the electorate they connect with, it is largely people who don't want to think about politics, the apolitical middle class who mostly didn't really do politics as anything other than a hobby until they found out that sometimes politics doesn't deliver the results you want. Whether that was Jeremy Corbyn's rise to the Labour leadership or the 2016 referendum result. In fact, those two events overlapping was really a perfect cocktail to melt these people's brains and saw them lashing out in ways that were counterproductive to their supposed principles. I'm not gonna wade into the Brexit of it all, but I will just make the point that it's not a coincidence that a big part of Starmer's appeal was that he was Mr. Remain, and it was built on a moment where he deviated from an agreed line and said that Remain would be on the ballot if there was a second referendum. I will also take this opportunity to point you all to friend of the channel Ember Green's video about how Remainers got in their own way in their efforts to stop Brexit. It's a good video, and it's made by someone who was much closer to Remainers and frankly has more to say about the topic than I do. That isn't just that I think these people are middle-class dickheads who got upset about trivial matters and lashed out at their only realistic route to solving the issue they apparently had. Genuinely, Remainers are the epitome of, I've got everything I wanted out of politics, how dare you not deliver it to me this one time. Really kind of like the most annoying tendency in British politics. I've described Starmer as a figure who has corroded our democracy and damaged our institutions, but he can't be separated from a process that's been ongoing since the 2008 financial crash. At moments where it seemed that this faction who seeks to control politics across all major parties and their allies in the press were maybe losing that control, we have seen behaviour that's frankly incompatible with a functional democracy. I think Keir Starmer and his surrounding project could not have felt able to do what they did without that process being ongoing. To use the 2019 election as an example, I will only pick out a few because, again, the way the press and certain politicians behaved during that election could fill out another multi-hour video. That election was marked by conduct from the press that, when compared to the preceding elections, where I would never say they were unbiased or conducting themselves perfectly, but at least broadcast journalism held to certain lines. There was a determination to give the most uncharitable reading of anything that could impact the then left-led Labour Party, which directly benefited Starmer as he already had a leadership campaign ready to go in the event of a defeat for the party, which looked likely given the polls. The first example I would draw your attention to is Punchgate, where it was falsely reported by several journalists across multiple outlets that an aide of the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock had been punched outside a hospital by a Labour activist. This was on the basis of rumours on social media, the kind of thing that you might think seasoned journalists would check before they breathlessly repeat. Certainly, it's hard to imagine if such a rumour was spread about Conservative activists or Liberal Democrat activists in that election, that they would have rushed in quite the same way. Some of these journalists apologised, but of course by then the damage had been done, so the apologies counted for nothing, and they faced no consequences. The other incident I'd point to is the fact that The Sun, a right-wing newspaper that's considered a bellwether for predicting election winners in the UK, published a Nazi conspiracy theory sourced from a group called Aryan Unity, alleging that the then leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was at the centre of, well, it's hard to describe it as anything other than a secret plot to undermine and destroy Britain. It's hard to emphasise how dangerous this was in the context of this particular election. Labour activists were regularly assaulted on the doorstep, and this was poorly reported on at the time. Treating this far-right conspiracy theory as legitimate served only, in my opinion, to endanger those activists more. Like, I was one of those activists, and everyone I knew had a story about being attacked on a doorstep. The person responsible for the publication, Tom Newton-Dunn, faced no consequences and, as far as I know, has never addressed this. But the article was deleted, and he has a rather embarrassing section on his Wikipedia page now, so I guess that's fine. I guess that's justice served, huh? There were, as I said, many other incidents I could get into, like Laura Kuenssberg potentially breaking electoral law on the BBC, but my point is that these egregious excesses had become the norm over the years preceding the 2019 election, and the lack of consequences for this both set the stage for Starmer to be who he was and degraded everything about our democracy, and I think led to a series of governments that have lowered our standard of living. Starmer is part of a process that includes Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, austerity, the rise in racism since 2008, Brexit, if you want to go there. He's only really able to be who he is because everything that happened before made his malfeasance and his transgressions the norm, as well as those of the surrounding project. The unfortunate truth is that Starmer is part of the small, insular elite of this country whose interests and political desires are completely opposed to what most of us want and need, which I know feels wrong to some because he's not cartoonishly corrupt or evil like Donald Trump, but he absolutely is cut from the same cloth. In those circumstances, can we be shocked that their reaction to an outsider from the left that briefly impeded and imperiled their careers was to smash everything in sight in order to preserve their clout and their jobs? This group of people across politics and the media clearly felt entitled to hold both political power and determine who gets a fair shot at it. It's ludicrously easy to tell when the British press has decided someone's time is up and they're going to turn up the difficulty dial. And that's bad whether that happens to a politician you like or don't like. Factional or convenient deploying of information that's relevant to the electorate can both deny the public the truth of a matter and allow problems to fester. When Starmer won the 2024 election, he was the pundits' candidate with a secret agenda tailored to their desires. And those desires are best summarized by what Starmer has decided to inflict on his way out. More belt tightening and more military spending at the behest of Donald Trump. A combination that's extremely damaging to the country, and is it any wonder in that case that Starmer and his project has moved towards authoritarianism and turned a blind eye to Britain's fascist movement? I talked about this at length in a previous video, so I'll spare you all here, but the point still stands. Could you imagine if Starmer or any politician who offers this platform were made to explain the impacts, namely that our military spending will largely go on buying American weapons at the expense of our already decaying living standards? These people looked at the 2010s with the degradation of our democracy, declining wages, declining living standards, the stage being set for escalations in racism and transphobia, and they said, you've had it too good for too long. Do you think they'd be able to do this in a democratic environment that functioned remotely as we're told it's meant to? That's not to say that I believe in bourgeois democracy or anything of the sort, but there is a specific offer that's made about the democracy we supposedly live under, and its degradation is what's imposed Starmer onto us. That's the fundamental point that renders him so illegitimate. He's so obviously an imposition forced onto us by reactionary centrists and their allies in the press. If he was put under any scrutiny or forced to be honest about what his project was, do we think he'd make it this far? I don't, and the fact that he has points to something fundamentally rotten about Britain that will take decades potentially to fix. This is the moment where I'm supposed to tell you what I think the point of Keir Starmer was, why he became Labour leader, why he went on to become Prime Minister, a question that it just feels especially important because no one forces you to become Prime Minister. It's not a job you get by accident. If Starmer at any point really felt that there was nothing for him to achieve, he could have resigned at any point before he did. When I try to articulate this, I always come back to the old heuristic. The purpose of a system is what it does. A lot of people will try to ascribe noble intentions to Starmer, often using his own words to justify that. They'll say he was a mediocre man not up to the job who wanted to try his best. Maybe there's a part of him that believes that, but you and I have to live with the consequences of what he's done. It's easy when we read books like The Fraud, or we see the internal drama of a political party spill out as Labour's did, to write it all off as inconsequential factionalism, a contained issue that has no spillover. But it did matter. We had a project imposed onto us who, in my view, saw their purpose as wresting control of their party back from people they saw as fundamentally illegitimate. Not for anything that put them outside of democratic norms. Really, a lot of Starmer's factional opponents and Labour Together's victims wouldn't be out of place in a lot of European centre-left parties. I mean, I suppose some would sit in European left parties, but our neighbours' democracies are able to allow that to exist. I'm sure there are issues with that, and stories of nasty factionalism and, you know, the weaponization of all sorts of issues over there too. I'm not saying the grass is greener. It's just striking how normal the people Starmer's project sought to remove from democratic politics were. It's also clear that this project wanted to engage in the time-honoured post-Thatcher tradition of the Labour Party, which is to tidy up the excesses of the previous Tory government, lock in the core elements of it, polish it up, and make it look functional. Of course, the conditions that enabled Blair to do this to quite some success weren't available to Starmer because he was at best an analog politician in a digital age. One whose timidity and desire to defer to established authority suited a pre-financial crash world. He also worked hard to restore the clout and prestige of a faction of Labour politics favoured by the press who had felt humiliated by the period in which they were forced to deal with a leadership they didn't agree with. Something every leftist has had to deal with every single day of their fucking lives. If I was to summarise Starmer's political project, I'd say this. It was a petty, corrupt, cowardly and wholly inadequate project that squandered one of the greatest opportunities to govern, mostly through the self-inflicted collapse of the Tories, handed to any party. And I'd say the same of the man, a petty, corrupt coward who had nothing to offer the country. I think back to that article whose headline was "Keir Starmer is the Labour Party in human form." And that headline was right. It's just that he shaped that Labour Party. He provided the blueprint for that Labour Party. He has demonstrably left the country in a worse state, and I'm sure none of the "what about the good stuff" people are still here because they would have got angry at one of the earlier bits. But the reason that line doesn't work is because you can't compel me to praise a government that's both marginalised me and others and has conducted itself in such a disgraceful way. Disabled people remain under attack. Everything is still absurdly expensive. Wages are still too low. Living standards are not improving. Rent is too high. The government displayed an at best neutral attitude to racist disorder and attempted pogroms on our streets. Motivated by an Islamophobia this government has embraced. They have advanced the cause of eliminating trans people from public life. Some would say that crosses the line into genocide, and when I'm confronted by the way this is conducted and the forces that they're listening to, I can't really see it any other way. That's before we get to the support for Israel, pre-disciplined by the anti-Semitism crisis into materially supporting genocide. There is no set of policies that can eliminate the stain all of that leaves on Starmer, on his allies, on his supporters. This country is a smaller, crueler, and more ugly place for having Starmer as Prime Minister. A reflection of the character of his political project, one that sought to do the same thing to his party, so can we be surprised that he's done it to the country as well? In terms of what comes next, Andy Burnham is going to become Prime Minister the day after this bit of the recording. And he already demonstrated some backsliding during the Makerfield by-election, essentially pitching himself as Starmer with a northern accent, which at least does us the courtesy of testing out whether what was wrong with Starmer's politics was just the way he communicated. There's a joke about Andy Burnham. A Blairite, a Brownite, and a Corbynite walk into a bar. The bartender says, "Good evening, Mr. Burnham." I think it's not the worst joke, and it does speak to something true about Burnham. He is a party man through and through. One of the points of uncertainty about him is which version of him we're getting. And it seems with Josh Simons, himself a key player in Labour Together, stepping aside for the by-election, and with a cabinet that, at least as of recording, is signalling continuity with Starmer's cabinet. I'm sure Editing SK will throw in some examples here of what's happened in the coming days. We are getting the secret fourth option. Starmerite Burnham. Though he's also picking up ex-Blair types too, summoning them from their crypt and really getting the Labour right gang back together, which shows the depth to which all of these projects are connected. What we're going to see is more of the same. Living standards hammered, the environment tarnished, just terrible policy that will necessitate more crackdowns and make this country more unlivable. The scale of the problems and crises facing the country are immense. Simply tinkering in the manner that Labour has gotten used to in the post-Thatcher years isn't going to cut it anymore. I understand people want to be optimistic. And they want to hope for the best. I get that. But none of the major parties are able to produce a politician capable of meeting this moment. There are a lot of factors as to why, but a big one is that our political leaders are mostly trying to solve the problems they wish existed. Starmer wanted the problem to be that the government didn't look sensible and grown up enough. Burnham seems to think that the problem is rooted in a lack of devolution and an overly centralised state and a lack of northern accent on our Prime Minister. Kemi Badenoch seems to believe the problem is the existence of literally anyone to her left. Farage wants the problem to be immigrants. It's none of these things. The real problem is rooted in something I think about a lot, just walking around where I live. There's this building I walk by almost every day, and actually we tried to record there, but that didn't really work. So we got some fantastic B-roll, but it's quite a striking building. I think it used to be a garage, but if you compare it to the buildings nearby, it stands out. Not just because it's disused and covered in graffiti, but because it's oddly pleasing to the eye. I walk by it, and I often find myself thinking about what we could use this building for. Clearly there's no use for it to be a garage anymore, and it clicked for me. This is the symbolic representation of a lot of what's wrong with Britain. We're regularly told that we've never had it so good, that the GDP has never been higher, that compared to our parents and grandparents, we have things they couldn't even dream of. But the truth is, this is the problem. This building used to be something. A place where people worked, chatted shit with their colleagues, did something that other people needed. Now it sits disused and it looks sad. And it makes me sad. The politician who can solve the crises facing the UK needs to be able to look at this building or buildings like it and understand what's wrong. And before anyone gets weird, no, this is not about the aesthetic of UK city centres like the far right like to go on about. It's about the fact that we are supposed to be a richer society than we've ever been before, and yet this country feels and looks poor. And it's precisely this building standing empty that symbolises that for me. It could be so much more, and yet we just leave it there. No thought as to whether the community could convert it into something, or it could be restored and repurposed. Its likely fate is to become student housing like so many of the other buildings around there. This country has so much wealth, and it sits in the hands of so few people, and that's what's killing us. That's what makes buildings like the one I'm talking about a depressing landmark. I'm sure those of you watching from the UK have a building like this near you, and it's just profoundly depressing. It makes me sad to see wasted potential. And that's what ultimately all of this has been. It's wasted potential and wasted time, and we can't get any of it back. But maybe we can enjoy giving Keir Starmer the send-off he deserves at the end of this all. So let's go do that right now. Hello everyone, welcome to the credits, where we will be sending Keir Starmer off in exactly the way he deserves. But first, I need to say, if you've enjoyed the video, please like, comment, subscribe, all of the good stuff, especially if you've made it this far. I mean, what's the harm? Also, for those of you interested, there will be a blooper reel on Patreon, completely free. So if you would like to see some behind the scenes, some bits of me being a bit silly, yeah, that's available for free for everyone. You do not need an account. It's just being hosted on Patreon. Go check it out if you feel like you'd enjoy that and you need a bit of a laugh. So yeah. And I need to announce, just before we get into some other stuff and some other people I need to thank, I'd like to announce that I'm just, in the month of August, I will be taking a full month off. I'm not going to be focusing on YouTube at all. I'm not even going to be, like, really working very much on this. I'll still be, like, canvassing for suggestions and sort of putting up a poll for videos in September, but I'm not going to be really working on this super actively, because frankly, at the end of something like this, I just need a bit of time off. It has been a massive undertaking doing this video. It's been, you know, needing to go to places to record. This script has gone through multiple revisions. I've had free proofreaders. You know, I've had to get people together to help me do some of these parts. I have a special, super secret guest coming maybe shortly after this bit is done. You know, you should probably stick around and see how that is. And on that note, I need to thank a lot of people, because none of my videos are really just me doing it on my own. There is always at least one person who contributes something to help me with these videos. And I don't thank people enough who support the channel, sort of outside of subscription, outside of like people who are like actively involved in the channel. And so I need to first of all thank effectively the crew for parts of this video. That is Brigitte Empire, who played camerawoman for a lot of this and played Keir Starmer in that opening sketch. Thank you to her. Please, please, please go check out her channel and please watch her videos, because if you don't, she can't come to Japan with me on holiday. You know, I know that's very first world problems, but she wants to come with me, so you got to go support her. Go do that. And I also want to thank my pyrotechnic specialists, as she wanted to be known, putting on that scene that you can see there on the screen, who is also my proofreader and is my proofreader for almost every video. But we had 2 extra proofreaders for this, the aforementioned camerawoman Brigitte Empire and my good friend Rosenkreutz. Again, check out both of their channels. They are very, very good YouTubers and deserve all of the success that they get. I need to also thank Molto, who made the thumbnail for this video. The thumbnail idea came to me in a dream, and I kind of texted her like, hey, so can we do this? What can we do with this? Is this something that we can do something with? And she just made it fucking amazing, basically. There's no real way around that. And with that, I need to thank the patrons and members, especially the top tier patrons. And those top tier patrons are Drone Riff, Kersley Scheider, Liron, Jar Jar Muba, and the YouTube members Nadia Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Ben Johnson. Thank you to all of them. If you want to support the channel in a more direct way, please, please, please consider going to the Patreon. There is a £1 tier. Any support is appreciated. And please consider becoming a YouTube member as well, because if we get enough YouTube members, I can be assured that YouTube will pay out. There is a minimum threshold, and I do not reach it super often, but the more people are members here, the more likely that is. I would really appreciate that, especially because after I'm done with my month's break, I'm going to come back and I'm going to really hit the ground running with... I'm not sure if we're going to have a change of direction, but I am going to be thinking very carefully about what I want to do here, what the quality of work I want to produce is, and whether I can do that with the current amount of resources I have at my disposal. I'd really like to be able to do things like this video more often, because I think people really enjoy when someone just sort of looks at a subject and charges headlong at it and just sort of dives into it to an absurd degree, like I have with Keir Starmer. You know, it's 3 videos and it's, what, 70-something thousand words I've written about him. And the truth is, I'd love to do more stuff like this, but it's a very intensive process and I can't really justify doing it right now. And so these will still happen, of course. I've even got an idea for what the next very long video is going to be. But if this type of video is something you like, please, please, please consider YouTube membership. Join the Patreon, even at £1. Honestly, it does make the world of difference, and you also get a lot of benefits like voting for topics. You get to suggest topics to me, you get access to the Discord, you get early access to at least 1 video a month. There are all sorts of benefits, and you also get my personal gratitude. And, you know, what's that worth? Is that worth at least £1? I think it might be. But anyway, everyone, thank you so much for watching this. I'm kind of sad that it's over, but it's time to move on. And there's no real better way to move on than by looking at the ashen remains of Starmer's manifesto and, well, maybe enjoying a little bit of, rumor-mongering, storytelling that's about to happen. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy what comes next. Goodbye.
Hi everyone, it's the post-credit scene with my friend Helena, No Justice MTG.
Which stands for Magic the Gathering, not Marjorie Taylor Greene, as we found out today.
Yeah, I just learned that today. I was told for the first time today that was what that was.
Fans of Jewish space stations are very disappointed.
I've had a couple of drinks, which is the perfect time to tell Helena, who has not heard this story before, the story about the thing I heard about Keir Starmer. Some fans of the Friends of the Show Praxis cast will know as the libel. Even though I don't think it's libel because it is, it's obviously not true. And if Keir Starmer wants to act like people would believe this, he's welcome to try. So this is a couple of Christmases ago. I'm going back to Reading. And this time I decided to go through London because there's some sort of cross-country's bullshit. I'm not taking cross-country. So I go down to London, which, I mean, it's funny to say now because East Midlands Rail was such a disaster, but I go down to St Pancras and I have to take the tube to get to Waterloo. And I end up sort of like being like, man, I quite urgently need to take a piss. So I get up in central London and I'm like, I'm going to eat the like pint cost in central London, find a pub, take a piss. So I go in, and I get myself a pint, I take my piss to get a pint, and then this guy walks up to me and he's like, hey mate, listen, I'm going to be completely honest with you, I'm homeless and I just fancy a pint. And I'm like, yeah, fine, I'll buy you a pint. And I get him a pint and he's like, that was really nice of you, like if you want to chat, just come outside, have a smoke, whatever. And I've got an hour and a half till my train, so I go out and I chat to him. And like he asks me what I do for a living, and I tell him what my day job is, and it is the most boring job that anyone has. And he's just kind of like, oh yeah, he's trying to be polite. And I'm like, oh, I also do YouTube. And then suddenly he perks up and he's like, oh, what have you done a video about? And this was just when I did the second Keir Starmer video. So obviously I tell him that I did that. And he's like, oh, I heard something about Keir Starmer. Do you want to hear it? And I'm like, absolutely, I do. Of course I want to hear about this. So he starts off and he's like, yeah, so Keir Starmer, I hear that he likes to hire sex workers. And I'm like, okay, like,
politician.
Welcome to politics in like the 70s, I guess. And then
the Keith Vaz era.
That's right, yeah, we're back in Keith Vaz. And then he tells me like, oh yeah, Keir Starmer likes to have like the sex workers put a collar and a leash on him and walk him around like that. And I'm like, okay, that's like 90s Tories, like that's kind of interesting, kind of like what his politics would tell you he's into. And then he tells me he likes to have the sex workers serve him fish and chips. And then the sex worker pisses on the fish and chips and he eats it. And that is what I heard about Keir Starmer from this man on my way back to my parents for Christmas. And
well, he's a pescatarian.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it all fits. And I was like, well, I genuinely, I had to like be engaged through this whole conversation and try not to give away how funny this was. But that is the thing I heard about Keir Starmer. And so yeah, there you go. And Keir Starmer, you're welcome to take me to court about that because it's just a thing I heard from some guy.
If you sue, it proves it's true.
That's right. That's how the law works. See ya, everyone. I'll see you for Andemonium.